So once again, welcome everyone. My name is Michael Toye. I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Community Economic Development Network. And today's seminar is Economic Security Towards an Inclusive Movement for Healthy, Vibrant Communities. I'm here with Annette Case, Senior Consultant and Project Manager with the Insight Center for Community Economic Development. And as part of the recently launched Metrics Matter initiative, Annette has devised and is implementing an action plan to improve public awareness about economic security, deploy data and measures that tell the story about economic security, and build public will to advance solutions that achieve meaningful progress for families and communities. Annette conducts policy research and analysis, developing policy solutions, as well as communications, outreach, and policy implementation strategies. In addition to her work at the Insight Center, Annette is consulted with the Northwest Area Foundation, Strategies to Eliminate Poverty Project, the Seattle Foundation, FutureWorks, the Working Poor Families Project, and the City of Seattle, and helped create what is now the Gwynn Center for Policy Studies. So she's been very busy, and we're very happy to have her with us. Thank you for joining us, Annette.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
So why don't we just start off with a bit of a background question. It seems like it's something that many of us would intuitively understand, but you've done a good work putting a lot more detail. What is economic security in the context of your campaign?
Yeah, well, and if we could go to the next slide, please. So we feel like economic security is a pretty comprehensive and multidimensional concept, and so we've tried to describe it in this way. Economic security is, healthy families connected to thriving communities, and we know that it's really important, and I'll talk a little bit more about these concepts later on, but that policies are really a key driver of shaping opportunity in place and what are the structures of opportunity in a community, and that those structures of opportunity really influence the ability of people to become economically secure and afford the basics, weather life's uncertainties, and be able to plan for tomorrow. And that's the overview of economic security. If you could go to the next slide, please. And we can come back to the slides if people want to later on during the question and answer. But we really came to this idea about what economic security, and we are working on a campaign to talk about what economic security is, really because as many people on the call may know, the U.S. measure of poverty is really a very low measure of income, and it really only describes a deprivation level of income. Really doesn't tell us a lot about how well people are doing or any sort of goal about what we should work for. We have a lot of national, state, and local groups that have developed a lot of new types of measures to help fill out that story about what economic security really is. And so at Metrics Matter and with the Economic Security Is campaign, we've really tried to take a lot of those different type of measures together and look at them and what is the story that they're trying to tell. And they through our many measures, we have a lot of they tell us a similar story, and so we've used those main themes to build our campaign, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But we also feel like the focus, in addition, we feel like economic security is really an inclusive approach. It's something that everybody, it's a goal we can all be working towards that includes everybody, and the focus on poverty can tend to reinforce stigma and exclusion of poverty. It creates an us versus them dynamic when we talk about who's poor. But when we talk about economic security, that really includes everyone who is either working to become economically secure. It's a goal for everyone, and or for people who already feel economically secure. And the campaign is really to take these themes and this inclusive approach and build public awareness about it, and also to create room for policy advancement. So we feel like we can use this campaign and these efforts to talk about economic security and what it is, and amplify policy efforts going on and create more room for policy advancements. And we really try to work closely with efforts to improve job quality and reduce inequality. We feel like this is an important piece of that story, and by being clear about what we hope to achieve and how policy ties into progress for individual economic security and community economic security, that will create room for advancements in policies. And I have been thinking in the U.S. context about minimum wage and paid time off, and I know that the policy context is a little bit different in Canada as well. Next slide, please. So talking a little bit more in depth about what economic security is and what we're talking about in terms of the Economic Security Is campaign. So we feel like it's important to talk about the concepts that people can resonate with. And in line with that, we talk about the ability to afford the basics, weather life's uncertainties, and plan for the future, really. And that's about being able to make it every day, make ends meet every day, the ability to, survive when you have a job loss or a health crisis, and be able to also look ahead and look to the future and know that you're not, one paycheck or one disaster away from falling into poverty, and that you can really plan for retirement, prepare for your children's education, and pass on wealth across the generations. But we also talk about income, because people, when we are talking about poverty, that's an income threshold, and so income, people also want a number. So we do use income thresholds. A lot of the measures that you will see, the alternative measures, are income thresholds to describe a level of economic security, and that's usually at least 2 times higher than the level of poverty. But it's multidimensional. It includes lots of different elements in terms of a household or family budget, such as housing, food, transportation, taxes, child care. It really incorporates a lot of the essentials that everybody can imagine are part of a basic family budget. But income is also often a proxy, which is why we talk about other measures, because it doesn't always account for everybody's differences in their needs. So, for example, if somebody has a different, different health situation, that could be more expensive. And so, an income doesn't really, income as a proxy for economic security doesn't really account for differences across families. Our understanding of economic security really needs to also keep up with living standards as basics change. So, for example, the internet is a really good example of that, that in terms of our concepts of economic security, that these days adults and children really need to understand how to use the internet if they're going to be able to find a job or be successful on the job or be successful in school. And I think, we're trying to connect all of these concepts together in terms of living standards, that we need to think about how our past policy decisions have affected the present and will affect the future, so particularly in the opportunities to build wealth and pass it on. In the U.S., we've made a lot of policy decisions in the past that have excluded people of color and women from access to good jobs and housing, and that's undermined ability to, get to build wealth and pass it along across the generation. And we see the legacy of these decisions in how well people are faring today. And I think the 2 other main concepts, so in addition to these basic ideas about making ends meet today and weathering uncertainties, planning for the future, that it's multi-generational and multi-dimensional. It's also that economic security, that place matters with economic security, and policy matters. So when it comes to place matters, we know that the opportunity to be economically secure really varies by place and community, local communities, and that's not only that the cost of living is different in communities, but really the structures of opportunity that influence a family's opportunity to thrive are different. So, how many doctors are available, what's the access to quality health care and child care, what about affordable housing, good food, good schools, good jobs that pay high wages with benefits. All of those things really influence people's ability and their opportunity for success later in life. And those opportunity structures are really tied to policy decisions that are made at the local, state, and federal levels. And they determine investments in public benefits. They determine what the minimum wages are and the investments in housing and the revenue available to invest in strong communities. So I think I can, and I would just say that that I think, we've seen those decisions and how they change in places like San Francisco and Seattle and LA, which have increased the minimum wage to $15 an hour or passed paid sick days, sick day laws, and we've seen that in decisions around Social Security Act in the U.S., which incorporates a lot of the values that are important in terms of Social Security, but at the time that it was passed, excluded tremendous amounts of people of color from access to those retirement benefits and unemployment insurance benefits. So I think it's important to be clear what matters to us in terms of both how we got where we are and to think about policy in terms of where we want to go.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, so that's, I think, a good introduction to how rich a framework that your economic security sort of outline offers, and when it comes to addressing opportunity and well-being for people. I think many people involved in my organization, the Canadian CCED Network, or even Tamarack's initiatives such as Cities Reducing Poverty, come from concern about poverty reduction or a poverty reduction lens or focus. In the U.S. last week, I think you just had a new release of poverty data. Can you perhaps, you mentioned earlier that the relationship between poverty and income, and poverty being one aspect of a broader framework. Can you perhaps make the connection between economic security and poverty a bit more clearly for us?
Yes, and if you can go to the next slide, please. So as Mike said, we did have an annual release of poverty data, which happened last week. That looks at, it tells the numbers across demographic and then later on about place in terms of who is in poverty and who is out of poverty, and often, and it also looks at income and health coverage. Excuse me. And often the story that is told when the poverty data comes out is who's in poverty and who's out of poverty, what are the disparities between groups, and it doesn't say a lot about how well people are doing or what it is that we're really trying to accomplish. And it can leave people hanging in terms of both how we got here and thinking about different benchmarks that we might have for what it is we want, and knowing that the poverty measure really falls far short of people being able to make ends meet. So part of the Economic Security Is campaign, we try to shift that understanding about poverty to add greater depth and dimension to it, and I'll walk through some of these. As part of the campaign, we created some infographics to help tell that story a little bit, and then we worked with a lot of our partners and allies to ask them, and we created talking points to have them help shift that conversation a little bit in their outreach and communications and reporting on the poverty data, with the idea that ultimately over time we can have a more nuanced conversation about not just whether people are poor or not, but I think when people aren't poor, I think people think they are faring well, but to really then create the whole story about what it takes to really make ends meet and move beyond that, and actually be able to plan for the future and experience economic mobility, and to have that be possible for everyone. So this first graph was really just to, at the national level, and to tie that as much as possible, to tie place and policy together to that story. So we wanted just to give a visual about what it looks like and the income threshold and what those income thresholds include, and where that stands in terms of our own U.S. discussion about minimum wage. And if you could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. And this looks at place matters, and this was just quick to sort of to show both how the thresholds and cost of living and supporting of the basics varies by place and city, and then also to look at what are the structures that exist in those communities that either help facilitate or are barriers to economic security. And though you can't, it's not a direct cause and effect, that you can't actually make that direct cause and effect about all of the data together. I think you do see that how you can see overall when you look at these, and I'm saying that from a statistical and economic perspective about cause and effect, but you can see really that it does really influence opportunity, as those communities that have policies and infrastructure that facilitate economic security tend to have overall better outcomes. And the next slide, please. And then this just looking at and tying that into the actual policies that those same communities have, and how those shape those opportunities and those structures in those communities. So we are constantly trying to shift the conversation, and as a specific example about that, using the data release of poverty to use that as an opportunity to shift the conversation by tying that into both what it is we're looking for, what are we trying to accomplish, helping people make ends meet, and how that is changes based on community and policy.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's really important, shifting the conversation, using those local examples to illustrate that, policies, whether they're federal, state, or provincial here in Canada, or even municipal, make a difference and can create a supportive and enabling environment for place-based action to happen. That's, I think, the relationships and explanations that warrant further conversation. So we have a lot of American friends on the call here today. I'm from Canada, and your infographic piqued our interest. From what you know, could you talk just for a few minutes about how you think this economic security model would fit or compare with the Canadian context as opposed to what you're doing in the U.S.?
Yeah, so I think, and those of us working on the policy fronts in the U.S. often look to Canada and wish we could, incorporate some of your policy achievements, and we work towards that. So, Canada obviously has created a lot of really important policy structures at the national level. But I think, it's important, and a lot of us do, we think that the local and national goes hand in hand, and we work on local and national. But I think that the place matters piece is really important as well, that needs to accompany that policy structure, because communities know really well who's falling through the cracks and know really what are the drivers in terms of creating those structures of opportunity and creating good schools, affordable housing, what are the job opportunities in a community. And so I think in terms of this economic security effort that everybody can work on together, that it is really important to think about how to move those levers at the local level, and working together to do that as well, to build up, to take advantage of those national policies, but to really create opportunity for all at the local level.
Yeah, I think you may look to Canada in terms of some of the policy achievements or the supportive policy choices we have, but I have to confess I often look to the U.S. in terms of the place-based, the innovative place-based practices and the array of local initiatives and groups that are active there. It's, I think you're well ahead of us there. So that really reinforces the point that we need both of them to be successful, and perhaps we can be learning from each other on both fronts.
Yes.
So that another, you made a good connection there with a poverty lens earlier between economic security. I think a lot of members in our organization, or local groups here in Canada at least, are often involved sometimes in sectoral, whether it's housing, job creation, even food security projects. They're involved in pretty sector-specific kind of initiatives, or at a very local level. How would you connect this broad framework of economic security to the work of a particular organization in a particular setting?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's, and sort of coming back to the place matters as well, but I think economic security, the framework, is really an umbrella under which a lot of people can stand, right? It's really multidimensional and complex, and and it's not necessarily always an easy soundbite to tell, but I think it is really important in terms of thinking about how people can coalesce and come together, knowing that everybody's stake is as part of that larger picture, and being able to always come back to that larger picture. So whether you work in legal services or food access or quality childcare or housing or on job quality, you have a stake in improving progress toward economic security. And I think knowing what your stake is really important, and then you can all, come together under that umbrella. And I think, at least in the U.S., we have budget fights that happen at the local, state, and national level. And I think, it can be the case that sometimes, because everybody ends up fighting over crumbs, and housing is working for their piece, and food support is working for their piece. Really, when you have the economic security framework, then you all really both are able to work together and not pit against one another, and kind of work together to conduct outreach and build awareness and have a support for the common cause that you're all working toward, knowing that if it's, this is the year for housing, then next year it'll be the year for childcare, if you're not able to move all the levers at once. But I would also say that when you have the economic security framework, you're able to move more levers at the same time, and we have some examples of that in the U.S. too. Minnesota has used the economic security campaign to really move a lot of levers and keep that conversation going and keep the momentum going when you're able to show how all of these pieces are part of the bigger picture about what you're trying to accomplish, and you're clear about what you're trying to accomplish.
Could you quickly just give one example? Maybe you mentioned there's a couple examples in the U.S. of how that working together within the framework has worked. Could you just give one example, perhaps, to illustrate?
Sure. So, and in Minnesota, we could, if people were interested, we could send out links afterwards about a few examples. But the example I mentioned in Minnesota, I believe it's actually, and I apologize if I'm getting the name wrong, but I believe it's the Economic Security Campaign, and they brought together, and I would say that even in our work with Economic Security is Campaign, it has brought together this cross-sector of groups that includes, reproductive rights groups and legal services, and everybody realizing that, everybody will benefit when everybody is more economically secure. And so they were able to pass, and again, I'm hoping I'm getting the exact details right, but improvements to the unemployment insurance system. They were able to increase the minimum wage. They're working on paid sick days and paid family leave together. And I believe they might have passed a pay equity law as well, or they're working on it. So they were able to pass some important, and they may have had a sick days campaign. I know they have a sick days campaign if they haven't actually passed the passed law on that. But they have used that to talk about all of those issues at the same time, and how all of those issues are necessary in terms of generating economic security for everybody.
Great, thank you. We're getting lots of questions coming in here, and so I want to get to those. But just perhaps to wind up then, can you talk a little bit, Annette, for us about where you're at in the campaign, what some of the next steps or future goals might be, as how the economic security model is going to move forward from here?
Yeah, so I think we are thinking that it's really important to help people to really address the concept of economic security, and that it's really not widely understood, and especially how all of the different data, because data can be complex and it can tell slightly different stories. So I think we're really working to advance that concept widely and share it broadly in lots of different communities. And then I think we really, at the same time and moving on a parallel track, want to be able to be advancing policies that help people become economically secure, and that's working at the local, state, and national level because of all those, because we know how much both of those are important and can reinforce one another, and doing work at the local level can build up to the national level. So we are working simultaneously to work on outreach with our partners and allies, and we would love for people to join us in that effort and to co-create this campaign with us. And we'll be holding a few events in the coming year, and also looking more specifically at some of the measures that are used and how those measures really help us tell the story. But ultimately, our main goals are to really be talking about economic security, both to help people understand the concept and shift the conversation toward it to create room for policy advancement. So we'll be working on those policies, either policies that are already available that people are working in their local communities to pass, or to use the data to help us identify new policies that might continue to improve economic security that we haven't yet uncovered.
Excellent. Well, you did launch there an invitation for people to connect and get involved. And on this next slide here, you can see a lot of opportunities for people to connect, to follow up with you, and also follow your work on social media. I think one of your comments earlier said that it doesn't fit well in a soundbite, but the infographics and what you've been able to share in a very quick 30 minutes here, I think is an extremely valuable overview of a very rich framework for understanding opportunity and well-being for people, and the combination of place and policy that really allows communities to thrive. So thank you for that, and I think it's a symptom of the value of this model that we have tons of questions we can try to jump into right away. So we're going to move into the question and answer part of our call. I'm going to start with a few that were submitted in advance, one from Cheryl in Peterborough, Ontario. And she asked, how can greater economic localization as complementary to the globalized economic model benefit people in poverty? And related to that, how can business itself become a source of economic improvement for marginalized persons?
Great, well, thank you. And oh, sorry, go ahead, Mike.
I was just going to say, any thoughts on that, Annette?
Yeah, so, and I appreciate all these great questions and people thinking about this material in advance as well. So, you know, I think in terms of the economic localization and globalized economic models, I think, you know, one thing about place matters is that we do a lot of learning when we do work at the local level, and that can really help both, you know, build up for what models you might want to be adopting at the national and global levels, and it also creates momentum for change, I think, at broader levels. So I think they tie together, and, you know, and as you said earlier too, Mike, we can do a lot of learning from one another. And so, so I think that would be my sense of how those fit together. And certainly if we have other questions, we can try to answer them more later if that doesn't fully answer the question. But in terms of business can be a source of economic improvement, I think there are lots of ways to think about this question. And one is that business, especially local businesses, have a real role to play in the community in terms of helping to create those structures of opportunity. So they can be a model for creating quality jobs with wages and benefits that allow people to participate in their community life and you know, invest back in their community, both as participating in their communities and being decision makers, as well as investing back in the businesses themselves. And it's sort of a positive continuing growth model. I think the other thing in terms of businesses being models in the community, you know, there are lots of, and I don't know if there are parallel associations in Canada, but we have businesses that have come together to basically talk about how they benefit when their employees benefit. So we have, for example, Main Street Alliance, which has worked on improving healthcare and other policy issues in the United States, and to have small business owners play a leadership role to say, we believe there are values, and it's not just that there are values, and they're important to us as business owners and the kind of businesses we want to be, and the returns that we see for our employees, that we think it's really important at all levels. And then I think, you know, and certainly, and then Insight also does a lot of work with employers as well through its national network of sector partners, and helping. I think there are roles to play for employers for connecting with skills, building skills for employees and helping them connect with employers who need those employees as well. So, and we can send out that information as well if people are interested. But I think there are, suffice it to say, I think there are lots of roles for business to play in their communities.
Very good. Question from Matt in Montreal. First one, actually, we've got another one coming up here, Matt, but are there ways to strengthen the link between economic development and people living in poverty, especially when revitalization or development can lead to gentrification or displacement? How can we make sure that people living in poverty aren't adversely affected by revitalization or development initiatives?
So I think that is where the framework of economic security really helps, when lots of groups can come together and coalesce around the goals that people want for a community, and working together in a if that's a coalition or in some format to be clear about what everybody wants in that community, and making sure that as development happens, that it also includes and doesn't displace affordable housing, or making sure that members of the community are hired in those jobs as the development is happening, and that they're receiving good training for high-paying jobs with benefits. And we work a lot with community benefit agreements as development is happening to make sure that a lot of these pieces are in place as development is going forward, and making sure that that it becomes an opportunity for everybody in the community, and that there is equity and access to those structures as the development is happening. That would be one.
Yeah, those community benefit agreements can be powerful tools for larger development projects. We have a number of resources related to that in the toolbox on our website if people are interested in more, and they can, I'm sure, just Google other resources as well. Good, thank you. Then to Virginia in Waco, Texas. What are messages around value creation or return on investment that resonate or make sense to business leaders? So it's another question about the role of business and the involvement of business in economic security.
Yeah, and I think, that again, I think that is thinking a lot about the type of communities that you want, and especially in terms of return on investment, I think is knowing that you want a high opportunity community for everyone. So you want a community that has good schools and good jobs that are accessible and affordable, quality housing that's affordable to everybody. I mean, that's accessible to everybody, excuse me. And I think the value statement is that both, that becomes, again, that sort of virtuous circle where people are able to invest in their communities, and that value comes back in real dollars to the business, because when they invest in the health of their community and people are participating well in their communities, they also have more money when they are economically secure. They're able to really invest back in those businesses. So I think that's really the return on investment for businesses.
Excellent. I would just add, I think in some research we'd done a few years ago looking into the motivations for the involvement of small business or private sector leaders in local revitalization or community economic development activities, a lot of it came down to an individual's commitment to their community that grew out of relationships and engagement there. So sometimes just cultivating those relationships and connections with business leaders, however that can be done, can lead to sometimes slightly different decisions or other opportunities created for businesses to get involved and to grow that involvement over time.
And if I could just add one more point around that as well, I think, I'm piggybacking on what you said, I think, a lot of times, and I think it is possible to work with larger or, national or multinational corporations and, and work on their sense of civic responsibility, but certainly when you are working with local businesses, there is a lot more ability to have a sense of civic responsibility and to know that when you are investing in the community, those investments are staying in the community and working to keep as much in the community as possible for the benefit of everyone.
Yeah, excellent. Linda in Battle Creek, Michigan is interested in the role universities can play in increasing community development.
So we love universities, and they have a lot of roles to play in increasing economic development, and so these are all wonderful questions. I think, on one hand, universities have a role to play in making sure that their education is affordable and accessible to everyone, and part of that is the financing, but also structuring the way education is offered to make sure that it's accessible for the different ways that people need to work, and that so many people are working and going to school, and may have families, and to think about that as well. I think there's a role to play in terms of creating a connection with the younger generation, and how they're reaching kids in high school and earlier, to know what opportunities are and be sort of inventive and creative there, to make universities a place that they want to be continuing on to after high school. And then, of course, there are a lot of ways that they can be connected to the community, whether it's research projects, or having their students out doing learning and public service projects within the community that benefit the community as well as the student. And that, of course, they're economic engines, and they're a source of employment, and they can also be a model employer in the community. So I think universities really have a strong role to play in terms of being connected to the community and making sure that there are lots of opportunities available for everyone to become economically secure and experience mobility as well.
Just related to that last point, Annette, and the economic engines that universities and colleges can be in a community, does the Insight Center have a project related to an anchor institution model, or where they can, universities might get some of their procurement locally or to support community development projects?
Oh, right. Well, and actually, I think, and I think you probably have an example that would be great to talk about as well. But we do have that's true in terms of procurement. That is because they are an economic engine in the community. Universities, of course, do significant amounts of buying, and they can think about how they do that at the local level and with local suppliers. That creates jobs at the local level, and ideally creates good jobs at the local level. And the Insight Center does have a project that it's working on called Big Buy, Invest, and Give Locally, and we could send out more material about that if people are interested on our website. But it is along those lines that when you work create that virtuous circle at your local level, you are creating benefits at all sorts of levels in terms of the economic growth as well as the kinds of jobs, and developing businesses at the local level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so if, Linda, if you do a quick Google of anchor institutions, you'll probably find the Democracy Collaborative website, and that approach really seems to be gaining momentum both in the US and Canada. I just saw a few weeks ago a new report by the Atkinson Foundation in Toronto that seems to be getting support from the city here, the municipality, around using the universities for anchor institutions. So that's definitely a strategy worth exploring. Now a question from Miles in Manhattan, Kansas, who's transitioning, it sounds like, into a new work setting where it's a rural natural resource base, some wealthy weekenders and retirees who are squeezing out middle and low-income homeowners. There's fewer manufacturing and more low-end service jobs. It sounds like an economic context that's probably not isolated to Manhattan, Kansas. Poor internet access in rural areas as well. His question is, how can we build the economic middle in that kind of setting?
Yeah, and I mean, it's such an important question, right? Because we want everyone, no matter where you live, you want to enjoy the beauty of the rural setting, and also make sure that everyone is able to enjoy and afford life in that setting, and have opportunities to thrive and be successful later on in life. So I think it's another example of that economic security framework in play, and trying to create high opportunity community. And I think actually, and Miles mentioned that poor internet access, I think something like that is actually a really great example of trying to create economic opportunity I talked about living standards before, and trying to make the case that we need to, that every community should be trying to keep up with living standards, and I think creating greater broadband access is both benefits everyone in the community and their ability to reach out to other communities, but also as a job creator as people are putting in the lines and expanding access. And I think those, there are ways to use that economic security framework to make the case in those local communities for making policy change and improving access to really critical infrastructure to improve economic security and grow the middle in all directions, grow and strengthen the middle.
Good. Yeah, I would just point to, I think the Institute for Local Self-Reliance has a lot of very good resources on community-based broadband business and projects, and they might have some specific resources related to that. But as you say, Annette, I think it seems like another case for the framework approach, trying to connect the different policy options with place-based initiatives to improve employment opportunities and decent paying jobs. The next question is from British Columbia, where there's a lot of rural and very remote, actually, Aboriginal communities. How would you see, Annette, an economic security framework? Would that be relevant, do you think, for remote and rural Aboriginal communities, from what you would guess?
Well, I of course am a big believer in economic security, so I think it fits everywhere because everyone I think would be interested in opportunities to thrive, and I think that really means something different to everybody, and so and that's why we use concepts more than really a lot of specific hard numbers, although we can also use the data. We also use the data to back up those concepts depending on the place. And so I do think that economic security framework can be adapted to fit anywhere, and I think the question is that to me is very much a place matters type of orientation, and would be an indication of what's happening in the community and what would make sense so that everybody, doing an assessment of who's faring well and who's not, and there would be a lot of different ways to benchmark that and to think about what is it that we want in terms of opportunity, and how would we, what kind of structures do we need to make that opportunity happen. So I think that's how I would adapt the framework, to really define it in terms of what makes sense to the community, the local community in that area. And I think that is, I was just going to say, and I think that is a way to bring people together if people are in agreement about those broad goals. Go ahead, Mike.
No, I was just wondering if, in the case of a First Nation, perhaps some of those policy levers might be a little closer to home, as opposed to, whether a provincial or federal government or state government things, situations for non-Aboriginal citizens, where it might seem that those are harder to change. I understand there's undoubtedly serious resource constraints, and perhaps some actions are limited based on relationships with the national governments, whether it's the U.S. or Canada. But I wonder if there wouldn't be a bit more flexibility in terms of innovation around some of those policy levers, depending on what the jurisdiction, what the First Nation or Band Council itself is doing.
Well, and I think, part of it, and you bring up an important part about the conversation. So part of it is the policy levers that, are those at the local level or the national level, and sometimes they're both. In the U.S., in terms of our Indian communities, it's definitely both. That, and at the state level as well, that there are lots of levers that can be pulled and should be. And part of it is also about making sure that we're having that conversation and that everybody is included in that conversation, and certainly the communities that are really impacted. So I think that's a really important point, and I appreciate you continuing that conversation, because I think it's really important to make sure that everybody is both part of the community action and part of, and then it's part of the discussion about, everybody benefiting from that opportunity to thrive. And so I think that can happen. That can happen at the local level, and then depending on the geographical boundaries, but also I think thinking about how that might be connected to federal policy as well, or national policy.
Excellent. So we have about 10 minutes left, and I think 8 questions if I've counted quickly. So we'll try to go quickly through these last ones. This question from Matt might be a bit more straightforward. He asked for suggestions for measurement in the Canadian context, seeing that the long-form census has been cut by the government. I don't know if you have any ideas, Annette, or I might hazard a quick answer to that.
Well, I definitely think you should hazard a quick answer. My very quick answer is that a lot of nonprofit groups have created their own measures, and I'm sure and we could do this later, we could put Matt in touch with some of those groups to maybe even create their own models that would make sense for what you're trying to accomplish. So I think to say, because we certainly have our challenges with national data as well, and so that's why a lot of groups have done their own work on that. So I think both are possible.
Great, so we can follow up with you for more info on that. And I would just say that I know that Tamarack Institute has partnered with the Canadian Council on Social Development for their community data program. And there are consortia of partners, municipalities mostly led, that involve community groups across the country that access a whole range of data sources, because as we know, the census, long-form census, was made voluntary here a while ago, so the quality of the data has been compromised. But there are other surveys that StatsCan does and other data sources, whether it's income data from CRA or Canada Revenue Agency, I should say, or even credit data from some of the credit record organizations that they can access. The CCSD, the Canadian Council on Social Development, has pulled together a really good range of data sources that they're making available to community partners. So that would be a one path to explore. From Leslie, and I think she sent her compliments there on the visual, the building blocks of opportunity, and that, which I liked as well. Actually, I think she might have been talking about the steps of toward economic security, suggested making each step more proportional to each other to communicate the difference as well, because obviously the affording the basics measure is higher than the other three, and even the supplemental and federal policy measure are pretty close.
That is a great suggestion. Yes, thank you. And just a quick point, we really appreciate that sort of feedback and welcome other thoughts and ideas, and the materials that I'm hoping these will also go out to everyone. You can connect to our site, and we really welcome people adding their own additions to our Tumblr site about your thoughts on economic security.
On the other graphic, the building blocks of opportunity, that was the one I was thinking of first. Leslie mentioned that she noticed that the policy choices and place elements don't include housing and food security. Was that explicit, or is it mostly a question of space in terms of the complexity of the model?
Yes, no, that's a great point. Yes, we didn't, and that's always. That is actually one of our challenges all the time whenever we're talking about any measure or how we're crafting the story, is that it's challenging to get everything in, or that everyone, that we've addressed every piece of it. So that's actually a great point, and it was mostly that space, and it was not intentional to leave those out at all. No. And sometimes it's also a data challenge. If we're that particular thing wouldn't have been a data challenge, but sometimes we also have data challenges in terms of what we wish we could do and what we are able to actually say. Right.
Yes, absolutely. Question from Cheryl. She says, when speaking of place, is your idea of economic security taking the spin-off or factors of economic localization into account? For example, local currencies that might have a multiplier effect, buy local policy supports, small loans or grants from localized investment vehicles, social enterprise, municipal procurement. Have you gotten into any of the modeling around some of those impacts of economic localization?
There are there are some models that do some of that, not probably all of those pieces, and there are lots of different models. So our notion is that, for a long time people have asked that there would be a new federal measure of economic security, and yet each of the different, just as you suggest, each of the different types of data sets and indices bring up something, show something different about economic security, and that there are lots of different angles and perspectives. So I think we feel like it's really important that either people are able to create their own that really, represents what's happening in their community, and more that that they can roll up into these larger frameworks and themes. So I would say yes, to an extent it includes that. In that particular graphic that we showed about affording the basics, it's not included in that number because that was the family budget calculator from the Economic Policy Institute. But there are some models that can show that, and if you're interested in some of those, we could have an offline conversation about that too.
Yeah, I'd be interested in those as well, so that's great. Thank you. A question from Carol. This is a big question here. We'll see how you grapple with it. The role, yeah, that's right. The role of policies at state, provincial, or national levels versus the local level in terms of their ability to influence good jobs. Where are we, when we want to create good jobs, who should be trying to do what, do you think? Where is it more important?
I tend to think they're all important, and it is a interrelated dynamic. So I think a lot of times what happens at the local level can influence the state level. So for example, I live in Seattle, Washington, and we had a fight and passed the minimum wage for 15, although of course that's over a number of years. But that conversation has then helped put greater pressure at the state level to further increase our state minimum wage, because for a long time we had the highest state minimum wage in the country, and now as this is gaining momentum, the conversations and the levers are changing. So I think it's a lot about where you think you can get traction, what it is you're trying to accomplish, and knowing that that can play a really important role in either direction. And just more knowing sort of I think the dynamics that are in play in your state and local and national levels, and trying to, at some level, push them all depending on your resources.
Excellent. Yeah, here's a related question perhaps to that. For local or municipal governments, are there specific budget recommendations that we should be sharing with them? Is there, for example, an equity lens that we could provide, or data that would that could be gathered that would support those kinds of positions?
The short answer is yes, and we could also have an offline conversation about that. And there are lots of models that look at that. So, and actually in Washington State, again, the Washington State Budget and Policy Center has put together a progress index, and that's a nonprofit organization that incorporates knowing that budgets are really value statements and priorities of what you want in your state. They've put together this index that pairs what happens in the budget with measures of economic security and ways that you can, to use that as leverage to continue to push the conversation. And so I think there are different ways to have that conversation, but there was another part of that question which I think I'm not answering because I was talking about that model.
I think that was good. An equity lens, yeah, and data to support.
Oh, and the equity lens, right? And so there are other data sources to also talk about equity. That Progress Index does also include equity, and that is really a critical piece of the conversation. I know the Policy Link has the Equity Atlas, and I think that's at a local level. There are many measures that also include data on equity, and we could talk about that as well if people are interested.
Great. So I'm going to try to squeeze one in. This won't be fair because it's a really big question, but there is a couple I'm going to try to put together related to environmental or climate changes. For example, we talk about economic growth and economic security, but that needs to be couched in, the question of whether or not unlimited growth is feasible, and does the economic security model take environmental, ecological, climate-related considerations into account at all?
So I think that's a really important question, and I think in terms of the building blocks that are building the future, that is where I would say, I think, yes, it does, because obviously the policies that shape place that think about really the future over the generations, I think that is really an important, the environment is really an important part of that. And there are indexes that include both environmental considerations and that take on the economic growth question, because I think there's a lot of discussion happening now about what is the purpose of economic of the economy, and is it really just about growth, or do we have other purposes that we're trying to accomplish? And so my personal take on it, which I don't necessarily want to say is necessarily represents insight centers, that I think although I think we do have a lot of agreement on this, that I think we need to think that is a really important question. We need to think about it. I don't think the answer is necessarily decided, but I think it's up for discussion. And I don't know that economic growth is necessarily should be the primary or certainly the only goal, because it's economic growth for what? And so all of these other elements should be important considerations in terms of what it is we're trying to accomplish. That was long-winded.
Nicely done. Yes, very good. So we are just out of time now. So I'm just going to make a few closing comments. So thank you very much, Annette, for joining us on this special webinar and sharing your expertise. And thank you to everyone who joined us today throughout Canada and the United States for your thoughtful questions. In a few days, Tamarack's going to be emailing you with links to the audio and other material related to today's call. And you can send an email to Tamarack at tamarackcommunity.ca to let us know what you thought of today's broadcast. You're also encouraged to check out other online and face-to-face events coming up. Here you can see a couple of Tamarack's upcoming events in Edmonton and evaluating community impact here in Montreal. And CCED-Net, we have our Manitoba Gathering coming up in October in Winnipeg, and our next national conference in Montreal in May of 2016. The last point I will say, there was one question. In Canada, we currently have a federal election going on, and there's a need. We heard a lot about the middle class, but there's a need to keep poverty on the radar, and there are a few campaigns related to that. I direct people to communityeconomies.ca, which is a resource page we've put together with materials to promote community economies, and many of our partners' campaigns there for more information. So thanks again to everyone and Annette, and I wish you all an excellent day.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks. Bye-bye.